High in the lonely spine of the northern mountains, there lived a man named Jonas Hale, with his 5 sons who had grown up as wild as the wolves that howled beyond the timberline. The mountain had shaped them into creatures of silence and muscle, men who spoke little and trusted no one. The air up there was so clean and thin, it almost hurt to breathe, and the trees whispered with secrets. No outsider ever heard Jonas had once been known in the valley towns as a strong but kind man who came down each winter to trade pelts and grain. But after his wife Mara died giving birth to their youngest boy, he disappeared into the peaks and built walls of stone and stubbornness around himself and his children. Years passed, and the Hale boys grew. Without a mother's touch, they learned to hunt before they learned to write. They learned to fight the cold before they learned to speak softly. Rowan, the oldest, was like the mountain itself, hard and immovable. Eli followed his father in strength, but not in heart, for a quiet sorrow always shadowed his eyes. Caleb had a quick temper, like dry tinder waiting for flame. Seth, the dreamer, often stared at the horizon as if he could see a world beyond the mist, and Luke, the youngest, carried in his face the last trace of Mara's warmth, which only deepened his father's pain. People in the valley whispered about the Hale family. They said no woman could last a day with them because they lived more like beasts than men. Some told stories that the family was cursed by the mountain itself, that any woman who tried to tame them would fall ill or run away in tears. A few brave souls tried to help once or twice, a school teacher who hoped to teach the boys their letters, a widow who thought she could bring comfort to Jonas, but each left before the next sunrise, bruised by harsh words or broken spirits. The trail to their cabin became a path no one dared to walk. The cabin itself stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking a sea of evergreens, and fog smoke from the chimney curled into the gray sky, but even the smoke seemed reluctant to linger. Jonas had built the place with his own hands, every board, every stone carrying the weight of loss. Inside it smelled of pine and old sorrow. The boys slept in rough bunks and ate what they hunted, deer, rabbit, fish, and sometimes nothing at all. They spoke in short, sharp sentences, and laughter was a sound they had long forgotten. Jonas carried his grief like a pack that never lightened, woke before dawn, split wood until his hands bled, and worked until darkness came. Not because he had to, but because rest invited memories he could not bear. He rarely spoke his wife's name, and when Luke asked about her, he would only say she was part of the mountain. Now the sons learned to read his silence as command, and they followed his ways without question. The mountain had become their teacher, their enemy, and their home. When the winter winds screamed across the ridges, the Hales would huddle inside their cabin, the fire crackling and shadows dancing on the walls. Jonas would sit by the door, gun in hand, listening to the night, while his sons sharpened knives or mended traps. Outside wolves prowled, but none dared approach, for they sensed that the true predators were inside the cabin. No woman had endured that place. No warmth had softened the hard faces within. The Hales lived as if the world beyond the mountain no longer existed, and perhaps in their hearts it truly did. For Jonas and his 5 sons, the mountain was not a refuge. It was a fortress built to keep love out and pain in. And though the valley below whispered their names with pity, none could guess that change was already on its way, climbing slowly through the mist toward the cabin that time had forgotten. The morning the stranger arrived, the mountain was wrapped in a restless fog that crept through the pines like breath from an unseen giant. The wind carried the smell of snow and the sound of a river. Swollen with rain, Jonas Hale stood by the woodpile, an axe heavy in his hands, his breath rising in small clouds. The world felt uneasy that day, as if the mountain itself was waiting for something he could not name. Far below, the narrow trail that wound toward the valley stirred with movement. two figures making their slow climb through mud and mist. The first was a young woman, slender but strong, wrapped in a wool coat too thin for the cold. Her name was Clara Dawson, and though she carried weariness in her step, there was a quiet purpose in her eyes. She had come from the orphanage in the valley, escorting a small girl who had been found alone near the old bridge. The child's name was Maggie, and she was no more than 6 years old. Pale hair tangled around her round face, eyes wide with the sort of wonder that even hardship could not dim. Clara had promised to find shelter before nightfall. But the path had turned treacherous rain, giving way to sleet, and the mountain showing its teeth. As they climbed higher, the trail narrowed to a ledge overlooking a deep ravine. A sudden rumble echoed above them, and before Clara could pull Maggie close, the hillside gave way in a roar of earth and rock. The landslide swallowed the path behind them, leaving nothing but shattered branches and silence. Clara's heart pounded as she looked ahead, seeing only the faint outline of smoke twisting above the trees. She had no choice but to follow it, hoping that whoever lived there would offer shelter from the storm. By the time she reached the cabin, the daylight had vanished into gray darkness. Jonas saw her first, a figure half buried in snow with a child clinging to her side. His sons gathered behind him, curious and cautious. Rowan stepped forward, hand on his knife. Eli frowned. Caleb muttered that no good came from strangers. Seth and Luke peeked from behind the doorway, their faces pale with surprise. Jonas raised his rifle, but only to show he was ready, not willing to. Trust Clara stood tall, though her legs trembled. She spoke his name softly, as if she had known it all her life, saying she meant no harm, that the storm had trapped them, and the child needed warmth. Jonas hesitated. The sight of the girl struck him, like a blow to the chest. Her small face peeking from under a soaked bonnet reminded him of a time long gone, when his own youngest had been that small. He lowered his rifle and motioned for them to enter. The cabin door groaned open, letting in a gust of cold and the smell of pine smoke. Maggie's eyes grew wide at the sight of the 5 brothers who stared back like wild creatures, unsure whether to flee or to fight. Inside, the warmth was rough but real. Clara knelt near the fire, rubbing Maggie's hands while the boys watched in silence. Seth offered a blanket hesitantly, as if afraid she might vanish. Rowan muttered that they should not stay. Eli said nothing, but his gaze softened when the girl smiled at him. Jonas stood in the corner, his expression carved from stone, yet something old and fragile flickered in his eyes. The stranger and the child had brought with them a quiet the cabin had never known. Outside, the storm gathered strength, wind howling through the trees, snow swirling in blinding waves. The mountains sealed them in together, 5 men, a stranger, and 1 little girl. The night stretched long and uncertain, and though no one spoke it, each of them felt that something had shifted. That day marked the beginning of change, though none of them yet understood how deeply the child would reach into their hearts, or how the mountain would never again be the same. Morning crept over the mountain, slow and silver the storm spent, but heavy clouds still hung low over the peaks. The world outside the cabin was buried in white silence, broken only by the hiss of wind against the door. Inside the Hale home, a strange calm had taken root. Clara had risen early to stir the fire, while Maggie sat wrapped in a quilt near the hearth, her small hands busy stacking wooden blocks Seth had carved for her. The 5 brothers watched in quiet confusion, for never before had laughter or play echoed inside those walls. Maggie's giggle sounded like birdsong in a place that had forgotten spring. Rowan pretended not to notice, yet his eyes softened whenever the girl looked his way. Eli fetched more wood without being asked, his movements steady and careful. Caleb grumbled that the noise was distracting, but his voice lacked its usual bite. Seth smiled more than he spoke, and Luke the youngest could not stop hovering near Maggie as if drawn by her warmth. Jonas sat by, the table sharpening his knife in silence, yet the rhythm of his work slowed his eyes, often flicking toward the child as though afraid she might vanish. If he looked away, Maggie was unafraid of them all. She asked questions about the mountain, about the deer tracks outside and the strange call of the ravens. She asked why the men never smiled and why their walls were so bare. When no one answered, she began to fill the silence herself, singing softly, the half-remembered lullabies the women at the orphanage had taught her. Her voice drifted through the cabin, and something in it loosened the air, made it lighter, made it human again. Clara watched the change with quiet wonder. She had expected resistance, perhaps even cruelty, but what she found was a family lost inside their own silence. The mountain had not made them cruel. She realized it had made them lonely. She began to speak with them gently, telling stories of the valley and asking about their hunts and their mother. Though they answered little, she could feel their guard lowering like snow melting from stone. Maggie did not see the hardness in them at all. To her, they were simply 5 big brothers who needed smiles more than words. One afternoon, Maggie followed Luke outside as he checked the traps. They returned with empty hands and flushed faces, laughing about the rabbit that had outsmarted them. Jonas watched from the porch, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. For the first time in years, he felt something stir beneath the weight of grief. The girl reminded him of Mara, the way she saw good, where others saw only danger, that innocent courage that refused to be dimmed. Each day, the little girl's kindness spread further like light crawling into dark corners. She helped Eli patch a torn coat. She listened to Seth's stories of the stars. She gave Caleb the smallest carved heart she had made from wood chips and told him it would keep him from frowning. Luke followed her everywhere, and when she laughed, he laughed too. For the first time since their mother's death, the Hale brothers spoke to each other without anger and shared food without silence. Jonas tried to remain apart, but one evening when Maggie tripped and scraped her knee, he was the first to reach her. His rough hands lifted her gently, and he found himself whispering words he had not spoken in years. Words of comfort that felt strange and warm on his tongue. Clara saw it then, the way the mountain man's eyes softened, and his shoulders lowered as if a burden had slipped away. Maggie looked up at him and smiled through her tears, saying she was brave like him, and he could not speak for fear his voice would break. That night, the fire burned brighter, and the cabin no longer felt like a cage. The girl who feared nothing had given them back something they had forgotten, not through wisdom or strength, but through simple love that asked for nothing in return. The Hale family had begun to change, though none of them yet knew that the greatest test was still waiting beyond the next storm. The peace that had settled over the mountain did not last long, for nature has a way of testing even the gentlest of miracles. The first warning came with the wind sharp and restless, carrying the scent of ice from the northern peaks. Jonas knew that smell too well. It meant the heart of winter was coming early. He told his sons to prepare the traps, to gather wood, to seal the windows, but the mountain had grown cunning through the years, and it struck before they were ready. By nightfall, snow began to fall thick and fast, swallowing the world beyond the door. The wind howled like something alive, tearing through the trees with a voice full of rage. The cabin shuddered under its fury. The brothers worked without complaint, feeding the fire, hauling logs, tightening the roof seams, but the storm grew wild beyond control. It was as if the mountain was jealous of the light that now lived within their walls, jealous of the laughter and the warmth that had begun to bloom there. When the worst of the wind hit the chimney, began to choke, sending smoke curling low across the room. Clara wrapped Maggie in blankets, holding her close as the temperature fell. Jonas shouted, orders, his deep voice fighting the roar of the storm. Caleb and Rowan braced the door. Eli moved to keep the fire alive. Seth tried to calm Luke, who trembled at every crash of thunder. But in the chaos, a faint sound rose from Maggie, a small cough. At first, then, another and another, until her little body shook with fever. The warmth that had filled the cabin only hours ago turned to fear. Clara pressed a hand to the girl's forehead and felt the heat burning under her skin. Panic flashed in her eyes as she looked toward Jonas, begging for help. He froze for a moment as though struck. The memory of another fever, another winter, another small body slipping away returned with brutal clarity. It was Mara all over again, and he could not bear it. For the first time in years, the mighty mountain man's hands shook. He told Eli to fetch water, Caleb to heat stones for warmth, Seth to bring herbs from the shelf, Luke to stay by the fire. They obeyed without question, the storm outside forgotten. Hours passed in a blur of snow and worry. Maggie's breathing grew shallow, and the cabin filled with the scent of smoke and sweat. Clara refused to rest, whispering words of comfort the way Jonas had once done for his wife, Rowan, and Eli took turns, holding the child upright, while Seth mixed herbs into a bitter tea. Luke cried quietly in the corner until Jonas knelt beside him and drew him close, his rough voice telling him that crying did not make him weak. It made him human. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilled across the cabin, showing faces drawn and weary. Maggie lay still, but her fever had broken. Her small hand rested in Jonas's large one, and for the first time in years, he bowed his head and prayed. Not to the mountain, not to fate, but to the memory of the woman he had loved. He promised her that he would not fail again, that he would keep this child and the people she had awakened safe from all harm. The storm raged for 2 more days, but it could no longer break them. Something had shifted within the Hale family. Fear had bound them tighter than blood, and in that binding, they found strength. Jonas no longer gave orders, he shared them. Rowan listened instead of argued. Caleb learned patience. Eli smiled. Seth hummed. Luke slept without fear. Clara sat beside Jonas as equal, not intruder. The mountain could rage and roar all it wanted, but inside that cabin there was light again. When the storm finally passed, the world outside was buried in white silence. The trees glittered with frost. The sky was clear and blue, and smoke rose steady from the chimney. Jonas stepped outside, feeling the cold bite his skin, but also something new and fierce in his chest. He looked back through the window and saw Maggie awake, her small smile brighter than the morning sun. He realized then that she had not only survived the storm, she had tamed it, and in doing so, she had tamed them all. The snow melted slow on the mountain, dripping from the eaves like tears of the sky. The long storm had passed, leaving the land quiet and clean. The trees stood heavy with frost that glittered in the sunlight, and the air felt softer than it had in years. Inside the Hale cabin, warmth breathed through every corner. The fire burned steady. The smell of pine and fresh bread filled the air, and laughter rose now and then, gentle and easy, as if it had always belonged there. Maggie sat by the window, carving a small bird from wood, her little fingers nimble and sure, while Luke watched in admiration, trying to copy her with his own clumsy hands. Jonas moved slower these days, but his steps carried peace, where once they carried only weight. He would rise early to split wood, then pause to watch the sun touch the ridges. He no longer feared the quiet for it, no longer brought ghosts. It brought life. Clara stood beside him most mornings, her face turned toward the same light. The woman who had come, as a stranger, now belonged to the mountain as deeply as the pines and the snow. Her laughter stirred something warm in Jonas that had been buried too long to name. The boys had changed too. Rowan had learned patience, and when he spoke, the others listened. Eli smiled, more than he frowned. Caleb's anger had softened into care. Seth still dreamed, but now he shared his dreams aloud, telling stories to Maggie of stars that never faded and worlds that lived beyond the peaks Luke no longer feared. The dark for Maggie's presence had taught him that light could be carried even in the smallest hands. Life on the mountain did not grow easy, but it grew full. There were still storms and hunger and days of silence, but now they faced them together. They worked as one, hunted as one, and shared their table with travelers who lost their way. The old rumors from the valley began to fade. No longer were the Hales whispered about as cursed or wild. Now people spoke of the family who would open their door to anyone who needed shelter, the family who had been changed by a child. Each evening Maggie would sit by the fire and tell stories she half remembered from Clara's tales and half invented on her own. She said the mountain was alive, that it had once been lonely and angry because it had no one to love it. She said when Jonas built his cabin, the mountain watched and waited for him to remember how to be kind. She said the mountain had sent her there so that the sadness would end. Brothers laughed at her wild imagination, but Jonas only smiled, for he could not shake the feeling that she might be right. Spring came slow but steady. Water ran clear in the streams and birds returned to the high branches. The cabin's door stood, open most days, letting in the scent of thawing earth and the sound of Maggie's laughter. Clara planted a small garden near the porch, and the boys helped her till the soil. Jonas built a swing from an old rope and watched the girl soar higher. Then the trees his heart light and unguarded for the first time in years. Sometimes at dusk, he would climb the ridge above the cabin and look down at the valley lights flickering far below. The wind would brush his face, and he would think of Mara, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. He would whisper her name and thank her for sending the little girl who had mended what death had broken. The mountain no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like home Maggie's bird carving sat on the mantel, smooth and small, a symbol of all they had learned. The Hale family had been tempered by grief, shaped by silence, and softened by love. The mountain that once kept the world out had finally opened its heart to it, and in the end, it was not strength or solitude that saved them, but the gentle courage of a child who believed no heart was too hard to change.